Since the very beginning of our ability to make pixels move on a screen, we've come up with ways to make them entertain us. This pursuit has continued to evolve across decades of technological breakthroughs, shifts in societal interests, and transformed into a medium that delivers stories and experiences beyond imagination. There is no understating the impact and influence that gaming has had on our culture. Played by hundreds of millions of people, responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars. And yet, something seems wrong. Despite the success of games across the industry, we can't go a week without major layoffs or studio closures being announced that suggest the gaming industry as a whole is circling the drain. But why? Not only are video games raking in the cash, but these profits are expected to continue to grow for the foreseeable future. So why does industry employment seem so unstable? And why does it seem like it's worse than ever before? Well, what if I told you I've looked at the data and this is completely normal? You might immediately think this has something to do with money, and you'd be right, but probably not in the way that you first think. To make explaining it to you as painless as possible, let's start with a few important notes off the bat. Based on the research conducted across publicly available data, we have reason to suspect that the cost for developing games is more than it has ever been. So much, in fact, that the cost for developing video games has gone up 10 times every 10 years since the early 90s. So, why are games getting more and more expensive? Marketing budgets aside, a lot of it simply has to do with basic technology. As we cram more polygons onto each and every asset in a game, the assets developed for modern gaming simply require more work to produce. Where we once had the potential for a single character designer to come up with a functioning rig in the span of around a week, it now takes teams of people, upwards of months, to achieve the same level of functionality on screen. In addition to that, games are also bigger than they've ever been before. Rather than cutting costs by making games smaller or shorter, development teams have had to keep pace with a consumer base that tends to increasingly measure its value based on the hours of content a game provides. Generally, people aren't going to care too much about your game looking twice as good, but they're definitely much more likely to mention it as a negative if it's half as long. There are, of course, games that serve as exception to this, but I'm not talking about stylistic choice or random one-off instances where a game happens to succeed, despite bucking the trend of expectations. I'm talking about the average. So save your comments for when I throw you into a complete rage later on. It's easy to see why games cost more to make, and with rare exception, devs can't really rely on cutting costs by making them shorter or delivering less content. That brings us to the question of who's actually paying for these games to get made. Well, the short answer is publishers. You know, those corporations that have traditionally been known for their upstanding morality, putting the employee first, and always making the choice that's right for the consumer. So how do these publishers decide which little charity pet project they want to fund?
Alright, let's make it eeny, meeny, miny, you.
Well, maybe it's not altruism after all. Okay, so they're a business, and they want to make their money back. I guess that's not so evil. Well, unfortunately it goes a little further than that. Even if the concept of a game is good, publishers just can't help themselves from doing a little market research of their own to find out what gamers want. Once they've drawn their conclusions from that data, well, it doesn't matter if it makes sense for it to be crammed into a specific project. They'll simply push to get it included for the sake of sales and marketing. Let's go with an example that everyone is likely familiar with: Fallout 76. Now, we all know the true main villain behind that disaster was... Todd? Can you move for a second? That's right, the corporate executives at Bethesda Softworks. You see, it seems as if these suits were very concerned with how much money Todd was leaving on the table and had been pressuring their development team for a multiplayer game for years. Up to that point, Todd had always held them at bay, telling them that the Fallout game they wanted to make, including multiplayer, was a bad idea. It wasn't until he was shown the data Bethesda had collected from fans, desperately opining for a multiplayer Fallout game, that he finally relented and the development team set about climbing that hill.
Have we waited long enough, guys?
And I think we all know how that ended up. While this specific example has a happy ending of sorts, there's plenty of examples of this ending very differently. Evolve was perhaps one of the first major releases to really take on asymmetrical multiplayer that seems to be thriving today. But turns out 2K wasn't convinced that sales alone would be enough. Similarly, Call of Duty, Destiny 2, and Overwatch have all been slammed by their communities for their greed, but these games all have something else very specific in common. So now that you understand why games cost so much and are difficult to make, I think it's time we look at the actual problem that's causing the issue. Well, the truth is, this is a cycle that is built into how games are made at a foundational level. To try and help you understand what I mean, let's look at the development timeline of Generic Shooter 17. On day one, the team consists of directors, managers for components, and then a handful of concept artists, writers, and system operators, all working to figure out what the foundation of the game will feel like. Once the overall direction of the game is laid down, they spend the next 3 to 12 months actually building it. This brings a huge influx of artists, coders, system engineers, and support staff that begin expanding the scope of the game until they have something that feels clunky, ugly, and underdeveloped, but it's playable. As long as things remain on track for a holiday season release, the game continues to see expansion. The game continues to see refinement. And eventually, 2 to 4 years before the game is actually released, we get the in-engine promo trailer. The dev team then spends another few months making changes and tweaks to expand the game based on feedback until it actually starts to feel pretty good. For the last home stretch of the game, the developers put together a red team that is tasked with finding everything broken and unfinished in the game. Those issues then make it onto a compiled list, and the people managing the project decide what they can actually afford to fix with the time they have left. What usually happens here is that the list of things that needs to be fixed is well in excess of the people that can do the fixing. So, all of a sudden, studios go through massive hiring sprees to get it all done.
You are now one of my elite employees.
Now, in the last 6 to 9 months before the game is released, you have dozens of new people being brought in with only a limited knowledge of the systems and direction of the game, and they're coming in at a time when everyone is already stressed out and overworked. But time marches on and expectations won't be loosened just because of a handful of nervous breakdowns here and there. So as the game's required holiday release date approaches, hype trains are at full speed, marketing money is flying out the window, and critic expectations for Generic Shooter are through the roof. This brings us to a period that is affectionately referred to as crunch time. During this period of time, devs, artists, coders, engineers, and QA will work non-stop, often in shifts of 12 to 16 hours a day to make sure that everything is done before the game finally ships. For what it's worth, I can confirm firsthand that crunch time is not only real, it is extremely punishing and brutal. Back when I worked as a manager for the QA team overseeing development of the Call of Duty series, there was more than one day where I pulled out my pillow and comforter to fall asleep under my desk rather than commute, since I was only getting a handful of hours of sleep anyway. Well, if conditions are so bad, why don't people just quit until publishers start respecting their employees more? Well, turns out quitting doesn't really do much. As we've already covered, it's not difficult for these companies to hire tons of people on short notice because
I need 40.
most of them are on the hunt for employment. Meaning that if you want to walk,
Who's coming with me? Who's coming with me?
well, you're likely headed out the door on your own, and you'll be replaced by someone who will work twice as hard because they're not already exhausted. The last component of this awful imbalance of power, as I mentioned before, is that many of these people work on contract. You make game, when game is done, you no longer make game. Now you might think that would kill worker productivity, but no. Because the carrot on the end of that stick is landing that sweet, sweet contract extension to be part of the team for any associated DLC. So instead of slacking off as you coast towards release, devs are likely working harder and longer than they ever have before to try and be the model employee in the hopes that they're one of the chosen few to receive a continuing paycheck. But as we fast forward to release, Generic Shooter comes out and people love it. A community forms around its nuanced beauty, perfect execution, and incredible features, and within the first couple of weeks of release, it's made $1 billion and people are comparing it to the greatest games of all time. An instant classic that will surely cement the studio as... Oh. So how did we end up here? Well, you know all those devs that were hired for the very tail end of development? Well, it turns out you don't actually need that many to keep generic shooter running once it's built. And all of those people that helped build out the foundation of the game? Well, most of them got let go months before release. You see, once a game's core foundation is established, you need less concept artists and more asset modelers. You need less script writers and more voice actors and sound engineers. In general, for the vast majority of roles, there simply isn't a need for them across the entire length of a project. And that brings us back to our first point. Games are making tons of money. And they're actually getting cheaper to make per megabyte. But what is it that actually costs publishers the most when you're making a game? Well, it turns out it's people. If you're licensing your game engine, hiring outside consultants, and paying for that sweet office space we're all supposed to fall back in love with for some reason, you're looking at a price tag of around $250,000. However, with the average salary of $80,000 a year for a AAA game studio developer, it turns out that even with only 50 employees on the books, personnel is costing you $4 million a year. When publishers begin looking at the balance sheets and staff is around 95% of the ongoing expenses, it's probably easy to see why layoffs are not the exception, but the rule. And you might be thinking to yourself, so Deej, even if that's all true, that doesn't explain why it feels like it's getting worse. Well, no, it doesn't. But that one is rather easy. You see, around 4 years ago, people around the world ended up locked indoors for extensive periods of time, and it seems like a lot of those people found themselves picking up some additional gaming to fill in those extended lunch breaks and commuting hours. When people were given the all clear, a lot of those people went out and touched grass in unison, and the massive uptick in active gamers during this time began to dwindle. So on top of seeing more game releases than we ever have before, we're seeing less and less interest in games in general as the gamers that remain look to spend their time on titles they're familiar with and already enjoy. And that leaves us with a bleak future for gaming. But there's still a spark that can light up the darkness. So where does that leave us? Thousands of talented people consistently ending up out of a job because the very system that employs them makes them scratch and claw just to do what they love. Full teams of people having their studio close because they become expendable once they've finished pouring their heart and soul into something they're passionate about. It's a depressing notion, and it's a problem that I'm hoping people smarter than me are already trying to find a fix for. But in the meantime, you can help by remembering that there isn't a dev out there that enjoys designing predatory microtransaction menus. Remember that the devs probably wanted to fix those bugs you ran into, but they were slaving away against unreasonable deadlines to fix a ton more you never got to see. Remember to support those devs as the passionate gamers that they are and aim your frustrations at the people signing the checks. You know, assuming that they actually signed the checks they were supposed to. Remember those devs when you stumble into every Easter egg that was made just for the most dedicated of gamers. Think of the artists when you see the attention paid to the small, subtle details that bring a game to life. And if you want to voice your frustrations to the dedicated professionals that craft the stories that move us, make sure to remember they probably had to fight for a lot of the amazing memories they've given you. And if this video happens to reach any of the talented developers, artists, writers, and actors that make these games that we love, just know that we're all rooting for you. Also, this video took me like 90 hours to compile and edit, so please make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. And until I see you next time, party on.